Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all today to this very special event. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute here at Brown, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you all Todd Stern. As you know, Todd was the U.S. Special Envoy for climate change. He was the U.S. Chief Climate Negotiator from 2009 to 2016. Again, as you know, Todd led the U.S. negotiating team at a series of UN climate change conferences, Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Doha, Lima, but the signature achievement for Todd and for the Obama administration, I would say, was the achievement of the Paris Conference and ultimately the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Todd will speak, I'm sure, a lot about the climate agreement, and I will ask him questions, but we know that the Paris 2015 agreement was the first climate agreement that included basically everybody, 190 roughly countries from all over the world, developed countries and developing countries. It set all of us on a path of high ambition, really. High ambition in terms of containing, hopefully, climate change to below 2 degrees centigrade, and plus adding a structure, really, of 5-year cycles of hopefully continually ratcheting up country targets. In addition, the 2015 agreement set strong and really completely new transparency standards, reporting standards for reporting inventories, and creating a set of reporting standards for understanding movement toward a series of new targets for climate remediation and carbon emissions remediation. The 2015 agreement really revived the whole basic architecture of climate remediation and the climate regime, and instead of looking, really to use Todd's words, instead of looking backward at where a country has been in terms of a development, is it rich, is it poor, is it developed, is it a developing country, instead looking forward to what countries will really do based on their own nationally determined choices and goals. And then lastly, or maybe not lastly, but additionally, the 2015 agreement recognized and enhanced our collective focus on adaptation, because we all, or most of us, I think, recognize that climate change is already happening, whether it's with sea level change or climate volatility or weather volatility, and we have to prepare. Let me just also say that Todd had previously served, he has a long career in public service. Todd had previously served in the Clinton administration as an assistant to the president and staff secretary in the White House from 1993 to 1998. And during that time, he was the senior White House negotiator at the Kyoto Protocol and the Buenos Aires negotiations in 1997 and 1998, respectively. So really, Todd, I think it's fair to say that you were present at the creation of climate policy. So let me just begin with some questions, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. And the first question I really wanted to ask Todd was, we're going to get to the future of the Paris Agreement, but in understanding really how we got from Kyoto, at least, to Paris, can you talk a little bit about the politics of that kind of what I think is a positive change?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Ed, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here in Brown. I have been here really only once before. It was to accompany my wife for her 10th reunion, and I've had the opportunity to walk around the campus and talk to some folks, and it's just lovely to be here. So thank you very much. So to go to your question on the politics, so let me just give a little bit of background and prehistory. So I started, as Ed said, I started on this issue when I was kind of unceremoniously drafted. I was minding my own business, doing something else. I got drafted into working on climate change in the White House in 1997, and the level of interest in this issue was enormously lower. The level of opposition and hostility, both on the business side and the labor side, was much, much higher. I used to joke in the White House that I was the only guy on the White House staff who could bring business and labor together, because they both joined together in hating the issue that I was working on. So that changed in various ways over time through the years. So the Kyoto Agreement that we reached was an interesting agreement. It was actually not a very feasible agreement. It had a lot of difficulties with it, and it was certainly not a ratifiable agreement in the United States, understanding that you need 2/3 vote in the Senate for agreements that need ratification. And when President Bush came in 2001, he promptly sort of took the U.S. out of the Kyoto process altogether, which itself created a backlash internationally. But on the international level, those 8 years were a fairly quiescent period. At the same time, and interestingly, there was increased activity and increased political buy-in during that period in the U.S. So you had Senator McCain, Republican from Arizona, teaming with Senator Lieberman from Connecticut, introduced the first so-called cap-and-trade bill, basically a mechanism by which you put a price on carbon. In 2003, they got 43 votes for that in the Senate. It's a lot of votes. Al Gore did his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. If you track, and obviously people do this, track the amount of press coverage for climate change, the amount of public opinion support for it was ramping up during those years, even though the Bush administration wasn't doing a whole lot. So then you fast forward, you take us to 2009. President Obama comes in, very committed to action. The first big step that was taken was an effort to get a new cap-and-trade bill done. It was championed by Congressman Waxman and Markey in the House. It actually passed the House. And it had a lot of corporate support. There was a corporate coalition called US CAP that had a bunch of big companies. Even before we, there's a quote that I found that as I was preparing for this that I recalled. This is even before Obama. This is 2005, just to give you a sense of where things were at and to bend your mind a little bit about how. Well, you can think about where we are now, but this is June 12th, 2005. The headline, the front page of USA Today, it's a big headline, said the debate's over, globe is warming, and then the first couple of sentences, don't look now, but the ground has shifted on global warming after decades of debate over whether the planet is heating, and if so, whose fault it is. Divergent groups are joining hands with little fanfare to deal with a problem they say people can no longer avoid. Okay, that's a lovely quote from 2005. So cap and trade in the Obama administration through the House, and then the forces of reaction to that really mobilized. I think they hadn't fully engaged in the House activity, but when the thing was coming to the Senate, full tilt opposition from the many players who had a stake in preventing this, and the kind of hot buttonization, if you will, of climate change took place over sort of in that period, and then the years that followed. If you think back to the 2012 Republican convention, you had Sarah Palin, the vice presidential candidate, leading the Republican convention in a raucous cheer of drill, baby, drill. I mean, climate change is a lot of bunk. We don't need to worry about that. We're going to go full tilt on oil and coal and the rest. And so you had that kind of reaction. And now I think over in the context of, well, hold off on right now, but up through Obama and with the success of Paris, I think that there's been significant political progress. What's going to happen now? And I think it's really not clear in terms of the public and political reaction broadly in the country. We know in the White House there is negativity around this issue. Whether that will spur, whether that will depress a commitment in action or spur it, I think we don't know yet. Other countries, and then I'll finish this overly long answer, sorry, but mostly climate change politically around the world is a post-partisan issue. it's not. I mean, if you have been in the UK, in France, in Germany, in many other places, whether you're sort of center right or center left parties were victorious, you still had significant commitment to action in climate change. China is sort of its own case, but has become quite invested in the development of renewable energy and clean energy, which is the solution side, essentially, of climate change. The places, I'd say the few places where you see some real political, local, domestic political activity of consequence on climate is India. India is very populist on this issue. The pressures are for India to be treated as a developing country with no obligations, no expectations, still a mindset that, in some ways recalls the old non-aligned movement, very hostile to much of the developed world on this issue. My first trip to India was with Secretary Clinton in 2009, and I was amused when I got there and opened I think it was the India Times. On about page 3, this was no secret that she was coming, and the fact that I was coming was sort of not the thing that you would see in making headlines, but there it was in headlines, and the headline was "Climate Man's Visit Shocks India." So I cut it out to save it because that was sort of too good to miss. But Australia, differently, Australia has had 2 or 3 governments fail because of climate change, either support or opposition. Australia is a heavily coal-dependent country, and I think that's probably explains a lot of its politics. And then the other place that comes to mind where you have real domestic political constraints is in the Middle East, a country like Saudi Arabia, where their whole economic well-being revolves around a product that is targeted, in effect, by climate change, and so they get some local politics there.
On sort of that note, I'm curious to know, Todd, when you were going into a negotiation like Lima or Paris, presumably behind you have all of these pressures, and some are the ones you mentioned, popular political pressures, certainly in the United States. It's just climate became and has become an issue of popular politics. But there must be, I assume, very complicated intra-industry or inter-industry politics, and there are winners, a new economy, and maybe some losers, old economy, and different technology plays for companies. So there must be very complicated commercial, corporate politics, complicated bureaucratic politics. Yeah. So how did you see those competing different types of politics playing out, and how did you respond to the pressures that were bearing down on you?
Well, so there certainly are different politics of that kind. I think that in an operational way, I mean, the politics that affected at some level everything that we did during the time I was there were the politics of Congress and the politics of the Senate above all. And I came into this job, with the incredibly valuable experience of having been at the COP. The COP is the Conference of the Parties, big meeting at the end of every year. First one was 1995. We just did number 22. Paris was number 21. But I came in at the beginning of this administration, 2009, absolutely knowing absolutely without any doubt that what we could not do was repeat Kyoto. We could not repeat an agreement that was structured like Kyoto, and we could not repeat the experience of the United States saying yes and then having a dead-on-arrival agreement in the U.S. Senate.
And if I could just interrupt, so the idea that we couldn't repeat in Kyoto is keeping developing countries out of or not pulling them into an agreement?
Well, we get there. Okay. So like step number 1, whatever's in the agreement, we cannot have an agreement where we say yes and it's dead on arrival in the Senate. Okay, so that sets that's sort of the true north of our approach. Okay, so what does that mean? So it means, among other things, yes, you have to have, Kyoto was an agreement in which all obligations were borne by developed countries. There was a firewall, strict separation between developed and developing. The developing countries, no matter how powerful or large or rapidly industrializing, were not touched by any of the obligations, and that particularly through the lens of China, which is the place where you always have the most sort of political angina on Capitol Hill. If you did anything like that again, you were going to be completely dead. So we were going to have to do an agreement either that was structured in such a way that you had a ghost of a chance to get 67 votes, and one theory of that, for example, would have been if the cap and trade bill got all the way done, and what we agreed to in an international agreement was basically identically the same thing in terms of a target that we had just gotten done in Congress. Maybe you would have had a chance, although even that would have been tough. The other way to go was to structure the agreement in such a way that it did not actually require Senate approval. And whether an agreement, there's all sorts of international agreements that do not go to the Senate. Some do, some don't. And whether they do have to or don't have to, all depends on the underlying authorities for what is agreed to. Sometimes there may be authorities already existing that provide a foundation for what you've agreed to, or just the way the structuring and the language of the agreement. So that we knew as a sort of central operating principle. And yes, of course, we knew that the fossil fuel industries were the most hostile to action, but we also knew that there were many more industrial players and corporate players that were open to this issue, that saw this issue as a real and important thing, and we didn't so much need to get into the intra-industry kind of machinations as much as to certainly develop as much support as we could from the corporate community as well as civil society and everywhere else. But again, underscoring that the real political driver for us was still the Hill.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about how was it actually done in moving from Kyoto to Paris? How was it done to get a series of countries to agree to participate in something like this when they hadn't been willing to before?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think that there was certainly an appetite for getting an agreement done. We came in 2009 kind of jumping onto a moving train of a negotiation which had been kicked off by a mandate at the Bali COP in 2007. So that 2007 meeting set in motion a negotiation that was supposed to culminate with a big, important new climate treaty in 2009. The world had had the experience of the US being on the outside of the Kyoto process from 2001 forward, and they knew that was not a viable path forward for an overall global climate agreement. We had not just the bias, we had the conviction that I already described that in any new agreement, it had to be inclusive of at least all the major players, developed and developing. And so the need to square the circle meant that you had to have an agreement that the U.S. could come into, but the U.S. was going to demand that others come in as well, and that sort of set the parameter. Now, having said that, the the Copenhagen negotiation in 2009 was hugely acrimonious. It was regarded by most as an abject failure in the end. The U.S. did not, and I did not share that view, but still it was very difficult. Certainly did not do what people had expected it to do. And people, frankly, when we came in, more or less expected that some version of the Kyoto paradigm could be repeated. And we came in, I went, the way these things are set up, there's the big meeting at the end of the year, but there's a few meetings of all countries during the year. Those are usually at the sub-ministerial level. For these purposes, I was a U.S. minister. Usually, and these meetings are held in Bonn. Usually, I would not go to those meetings, but because we had been absent for 8 years, I went to that very first meeting in Bonn in March of 2009, and I gave a set of remarks from the floor, saying that the U.S. is back, we're here, we want to engage, blah blah blah. I got a kind of standing ovation, and I said to the person on our team next to me, that will be the last standing ovation. That will be the last ovation period that we get for the next, for the rest of this term. Because I knew, yes, it's great that the U.S. is back, but I knew that we had demands that a lot of countries did not like. But so you had these basic, the U.S. has to be in, the U.S. is going to require other countries to be in, so then you start negotiating. How can that work? What's the nature of the structure of the deal? How do you handle the major issues of mitigation and finance and transparency and the legal form of the agreement and the basic, remember that firewall? How are we going to, you can't just knock it down all at once, that's not going to work, but how can you evolve that forward? And those became all the issues that were intensively discussed that year and then ever after.
Right. My sense as an outside observer after the 2015 Paris Agreement was that there were two types of criticism or cautionary notes that were leveled at you and the Obama administration. One of those was maybe the deal doesn't go far enough. The problem is huge and the deal is modest. And then the second criticism was it's not enforceable, and right. This country or that, China, other countries are really not going to abide by their commitments. I guess it's in some ways ironic, or it's just strange that those criticisms seem to have been left in the dust now that it feels as if the almost global political willingness to deal with climate change, or at least in key advanced industrial economies, seems to have evaporated. Whether it's the anger surrounding Brexit or the anger surrounding Trumpism, insurgency politically, whatever we think of it, insurgency seems to have overwhelmed those practical concerns and criticisms. So do you think is it a temporary moment and we'll eventually get back to the issues about the scope of the deal and the enforceability of these kinds of arrangements, or are we just in a different world now?
Okay, so let me unpack that
okay.
a little bit. I'll get to Brexit and the developments and the political developments in the world in a second, but a couple of comments on whether Paris went far enough and the issue of enforceability. So Paris absolutely did not go far enough in the sense that the targets that were put forward in 2015 don't put the world on the track of the goals articulated in Paris, right? So the goals articulated in Paris are the temperature goals at the simplest level are to hold the increase in temperature above pre-industrial levels to, quote, well below 2 degrees centigrade, and even to do your best to kind of get on a 1.5 track, which would be great, although very difficult. But here's the thing, and we knew this absolutely without question, you can't start unless you start. And if we would have, and there were countries who took this position, but I never, I am an art of the possible guy, right? I'm a political guy who is sort of determined to get us going. That was sort of my approach. And there were those who would have liked to have carved up the below 2 degrees in the sense of what reduction was needed by, say, 2025, 2030, divided that up among all the key countries in the world, sort of divvied out what everybody had to do, and then on paper we would have been on our way. And the thing is, it would have failed because countries were absolutely not prepared to do that. You would not have had an agreement that was workable. So we wanted to get started. We knew that to get a universal agreement, we needed to flip the paradigm from Kyoto, which was a top-down negotiation of targets among the developed countries, into a bottom-up approach based on nationally determined targets that countries can decide on for themselves. Hopefully with as much salutary pressure as possible for those to be ambitious, but you had to start that way. We accompanied that with the strong goals that were built into Paris, and by a set of 5-year repeating cycles that are designed to push countries to ramp up their targets. So the cycles, the 2 different cycles, one starts in 2018 and is an aggregate cycle, how's the world doing against our goals? And then in 2020, every 5 years, a review of country targets to push countries to increase them. Okay, was that enough? Well, again, the numbers weren't enough, but the structure was actually, I think, very good and beyond what most people thought was possible. And if you go back, even as late as the fall, even going into Paris, there were any number of countries very unhappy at the notion that there would be 5-year cycles. We don't need 5-year cycles. We'll do once. We'll see. But we and other countries were very determined on that point.
Did you go into Paris expecting to come out with a deal?
I did, but I didn't go into Paris thinking in any way, shape, or form that a deal was in the bag. And indeed, there was a push in Paris by any number of countries for a kind of minimalist agreement.
Right.
And I remember the first day, the worst day for me of any COP, or the worst 2 days of any COP that I ever went to, was the first day or two when I would walk into the, it was like the movie Groundhog Day. I'd go in and the rhetoric would seem to be the same. Even though I knew we were actually making progress, countries would drag out the old rhetoric. And I said to one of the people on my team, very first day in Paris, I think if you were just a totally cold-blooded, gambler, and looking at who's got the better hand, the people who want to come up minimalist have a better hand because it's sort of easier to get a little bit done and block more than to get a lot done. In fact, we got a lot done. On enforceability, so that goes back to the question of whether the agreement, well, it is taken to be a question of whether the agreement is legally binding. This agreement is partly legally binding, partly not. The targets are not legally binding. The transparency and accountability provisions are legally binding. But the reality is very few international regimes have true, you get penalized, you have to pay a fine, we have to put you in the stockade if you fail to do what you've agreed to do. It's very unusual in international. The WTO does some of that. But it was completely not negotiable in this kind of context. We never would have got a deal on that basis. And I think for us, you also would have had many countries among the developing world who would not have signed on to an agreement with legally binding targets. And for us, that was a one-way ticket to ratification in the Senate, which we would have failed on. So there were good reasons not to go that direction. And I would argue strongly that actually, had targets been legally binding, you would have had lower ambition because countries fearful of the consequences would lowball their targets. So I argued, and I would say to this day that we did better off without legally binding targets.
Right, but for the politics of the present, regardless of whatever we think about the politics,
the second part of your question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. I think we don't know. I think that we have what is, from from the point of view of a climate change, somebody committed to action on climate change, certainly the results of the U.S. election were unwelcome. Just put it that way. And we don't know exactly what the Trump administration is going to do with respect to Paris. There is a lively debate, if not struggle, going on in the White House right now over whether to pull out of Paris or not. I actually, for anybody who cares to see what I have to say in writing in 800 words, it's on the Brookings website, just from a couple of days ago on what I
recommend it, and also your Washington Post.
Yeah, and Washington Post a few weeks before that. Yeah, so I think it is clear domestically that there's going to be a pullback. I mean, we know that now, that there's going to be an effort to undo the big power plant regulation. There is a lot of talk about trying to reduce the so-called CAFE standards, the efficiency standards for cars and trucks. There's talk about undoing some good regulations that got put in place on methane, which is another greenhouse gas, not as important as CO2, but also important. So in all of those ways, it's going to be weaker domestically, but and that's just a fact of life. What I think you will see is a lot of action from progressive states, from cities to ramp up their game. I've been talking with some of them. I'm not just speculating. I know that this kind of effort is underway. So I think you're going to have, and that's not going to offset everything negative that happens at the national level, but I think it will partly offset. It won't fully offset, but it'll be helpful. With respect to Paris, as I say, we don't know yet. I am hopeful that the Trump administration sees that even through the lens of a climate skeptic, it still makes sense to stay in Paris for a whole bunch of reasons, and it would be very damaging to U.S. interests and equities all over the world, way beyond climate change, for the U.S. to pull out, because it would be seen as a real betrayal by the rest of the world. England, so obviously the UK made a hugely consequential move in Brexit, but I do not think that the current government is going to go far backwards, if backwards at all, on climate. I think that the French election is just hugely consequential in Europe right now, and probably most of you don't follow the ins and outs of domestic French politics, but it's ugly right now. And you have Marine Le Pen, who's the kind of right-wing populist, better positioned to win that election than anybody would have ever expected. And it's not just because of Brexit. It's also true that the center-right candidate is kind of imploding, but refuses to get out of the race to cede the ground to a more probable candidate. And so I think we need to cross fingers, because if the UK goes and then France goes, because Le Pen is anti-EU, be very, very challenging for the EU. And the EU is a big, important kind of anchor player in the traditionally along with the U.S. on climate. So, but I think it's a big exaggeration to say everybody is like sort of saying never mind with Paris, never mind with climate remediation. I don't agree with that. I think China is going pretty much full tilt. I think a lot of countries in the world are still going forward with what they've been talking about, including Europe.
Right.
The U.S. is the one who will be the biggest, will be taking the biggest step in a backwards direction, and it is just, whether you like it or not, it is in fact the case the U.S., in my own experience at least, is an indispensable player on the international, the global scene. So that certainly will hurt, but my hope again is that we stay in the regime and keep the regime from going off the rails over the course of the next 4 years.
I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment, so especially to students in the room, but to everybody. Think of questions, and we have a couple of mics. We have a mic in each aisle, so in just a moment I'm going to ask you to line up, and we're going to devote a lot of time for Q&A. But I have a question that follows a little bit on the last point you made, Todd. Again, as an outsider, I never completely understood why climate remediation seems to be treated so frequently, not at all by you, but kind of popularly, as a bitter pill to be swallowed, as a cost. And I mean, yes, we're facing this huge problem, or even if we're a little skeptical, it makes sense to think about insurance in the event that there's a huge problem, but still it's presented as a cost, a burden we have to bear. And a slightly different way to look at it is, this is an opportunity for unbelievable acceleration on the technology front and the new economy and new energy sources, and just almost like a space program-like opportunity to change the way we live our lives. And I mean, that sounds a little perhaps extreme, but it's different from the populist framing today, which is, this is a problem, we don't even really know whether it's a problem, but it's a rich person's problem, and the poor person is going to bear the brunt. Just the last thing I'd say about that is, of course I spend a lot of time in China, and by no means a perfect place, but there is more of a sense in that country of climate remediation as industrial policy, and climate remediation as innovation policy, and sort of climate remediation as a way of modernizing a country. Maybe that's a crazy idea, but is it a crazy idea?
Well, no, I mean, it's not at all a crazy idea. We have an enormously different political culture in just about every way imaginable. So look, I think that historically there are a few different problems. I could not agree with you more that the best way and really the right way to look at this issue and what needs to be done to solve it is to seize the opportunity that is economic, that is an opportunity to improve health and well-being in a million ways. So I'm completely there. But to try to analyze, so what is the problem politically here? I think historically, a few things. First of all, there is cost in the shorter run. The cost keeps getting less, right? Because there had just been dramatic reductions, for example, in the cost of renewable energy. In the Obama years, the cost of wind dropped 66%, the cost of solar dropped 85%. The cost of storage, electricity storage, storage of renewable energy, which is actually hugely important, because if you think about how much can a power grid depend on renewables, you have this little problem with respect to the sun is it's not always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. If you had a capacity to capture and store solar and wind energy, then when the sun's not shining, when the wind's not blowing, you can keep the grid running. There's also, and the cost curves on that are they're a little behind wind and solar, but they're gonna be coming down dramatically. So it costs less than it used to, but still it still costs something. The notion of not being able to use all the fossil fuels, the cheap fossil fuels that we've been living on, and having to replace them with forms of energy that have been more expensive, and in some senses even today are more expensive. That is a cost. And the other thing that you have to remember is it seems to be more of a cost because we do not capture what economists refer to as the externalities of polluting energy. So that means that the intense damage that's done to healthcare and all sorts of things by pollution doesn't get captured in the cost. That's what cap and trade is all about. That's what a carbon tax would be all about. Let's capture those costs. Carbon pollution costs something. Let's put a price on. A normal price at this stage, according to economists, would be something like $40 a ton of carbon. So, but there is cost. That's A. B, we have a culture in the U.S. And be an interesting study. I'm sure there have been 20 of where this came from. But for a lot of people, maybe a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump in the election, the notion of environmentalists and environmentalism is culturally suspect or worse. And I am quite persuaded at this point that the messenger is a lot more important than the message at this point in affecting attitudes in the United States about climate change. People need to hear things from their own tribe. I mean, we're learning that, unfortunately, more and more. And so if you get all the best arguments from people who seem alien, it doesn't help as much as if you have somebody who seems familiar. So, and I think that sense about environmentalists is something that's not been here forever, by the way. I mean, the original cap and trade bill was done by Republicans in the first Bush administration to deal with the problem of acid rain. And environmentalists opposed it because the notion that you could buy and sell pollution credits seemed immoral. But Republicans prevailed, and it worked like a charm, right? I mean, it worked faster and at a lower cost than ever anticipated, and at that point, environmentalists embraced it. But some years down the road, it became seen as again, just a scheme of left-wing pinko environmentalists. So there is some of that cultural animus also. But yeah, look, there is no question that the transformation to low carbon energy is one of the biggest it's not just one of the biggest challenges, it's one of the biggest economic opportunities in front of us right now. There's no country in the world who's got a comparative advantage in this area like the United States does, because it's all about innovation, and we have an innovation infrastructure and culture that's absolutely second to none. And this is part of what I wrote in the Washington Post op-ed from late January, that if Trump was at all smart about this issue, he would grab it and embrace it, because there's huge upside. But he's also running into, and probably shares, some of the ideological biases against it.
Right. Thanks. Let's open it up, and you can ask any questions of Todd, technical ones about deals, but even questions about Todd's own career in public service, particularly on the climate front. Any questions? Yes, please. And go ahead and line up behind the mics. And mention who you are, please. That mic doesn't sound as if it's on. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Austin. I'm a sophomore here. My question is just there's an argument against having developing countries participate in emissions reduction, which is that if they have cheaper energy, they could move more people out of extreme poverty faster. And how do you weigh that kind of lost or foregone benefit to the very poor in those countries versus climate change?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think that there is no way to develop sustainably unless you develop sustainably. So if you put in place high polluting infrastructure that's going to be around not just for a few years but for decades, you're creating serious problems. Now, it is also true that there are some poor countries where you're still going to have some of that development, and where their level of emissions is so modest right now that it's not going to have a huge impact globally. But so I'm not saying never ever can you have fossil fuel based power, because you very much need to get access to electricity to poor countries. But to the extent that you can get that access to be clean energy, you're that much further ahead of the game. And the other thing that you have to bear in mind with respect to really poor countries is for them, and I dealt with this in all of the negotiations, they are generally way more focused on support for what's called adaptation, building resilience and building the capacity to recover from bad events than they are on the mitigation side.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Aubrey. My question is, in light of those economic factors that you mentioned, like the increasing profitability of renewables, do you think that market forces can correct for political inaction or failure in coming years?
So I think the answer to that is partly yes, not entirely, but partly yes. I mean, the Clean Power Plan that the Trump administration is probably going to, almost certainly going to take a meat axe to, calls for 32% reduction from that sector compared to 2005 by 2030. The developments in the real economy, if you will, the developments like the very rapid decline in the price of wind and solar have taken us already, we're already at a 24% reduction, right? So these things are moving, and I think that these cost curves are going to continue going down, and we are actually in much of the world at a place where new wind and solar is directly cost competitive to new coal or natural gas. Not quite true in the U.S. because, it's true that they would be competitive with new. It's just that the infrastructure in the U.S. is generally existing coal plants where they have already been paid off, so their cost is lower. But these developments absolutely are going to push us further along the path of where in the direction we want to go than we might have thought even just 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. But what's also true is policy does matter, right? So that if you had, for example, a price on carbon, then every company is considering that price as they're weighing what kind of energy to use. If you have renewable portfolio standards in 29 states right now, those are hugely important. If those continue, if those ramp up, if those spread to other states, that again helps push utilities to choose wind and solar because they have to. If the CAFE standards, I mean, there's an article I read in the paper today, if CAFE standards, the vehicle standards, get weakened, which is a serious conversation going on right now, then instead of being on the path from where Obama started, 27 miles a gallon, pointing toward 54 miles a gallon by the middle of the 2020s, if those only end up going to, say, the mid-40s, then you've lost a lot of benefit that as compared to what you'd otherwise have. The Department of Energy has had a whole series of efficiency standards, requirements for efficiency in buildings, to everything that makes buildings work. Those are hugely important. To the extent that you pull back from policy, it's just going to go slower. So you can pick up some of it with changes in the economy, and at the point where any old kind of building of solar and wind is going to be better than any old kind of use of coal or natural gas, for example, then it'll go faster and faster. But policy does matter.
I have a quick follow-up on that, Todd. So you mentioned the renewable portfolio standards. So a number of those are in Republican states, but maybe from a different era of the Republican Party. In a Trump era, with a lot of red in a number of those states, are those standards likely to last? Is there a constituency in the evolving Republican Party for these types of regulatory measures?
I think the answer is that there is. There's, I think 11 states. 11 states get 10% or more of their energy from wind. 30% in Iowa, 25% in South Dakota. Texas is the biggest wind producer in the country. Kansas is big. These are all red states, but they're making a lot of money off of wind. They've got big wind producers that have a stake in this continuing. And I think in situations like that, politicians, I mean, some of them are just sort of purely ideological, but mostly they're responding to maybe ideological, but if there's now a vested interest in keeping this going, then I think they're likely to do that. There was a big important, the one legislative thing that actually got done during the Obama years at the end of 2015 was a re-upping of tax credits for the development of wind and solar, sort of phasing out in various different ways, but lasting for about 5 years. Those things are hugely important. They're propelling the development of more. They just make the economics better. And I don't think you'll see Republican opposition to that. I mean, the reason it got done in the first place, it had to get done with Republican support because they're popular. And here's a fact that is worth knowing. 75% of Trump supporters are strongly in support of clean energy development. Right?
Be interesting to see how that plays out politically. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm John. I'm a senior. So, as you mentioned, with the absence of federal action, there's a lot of increasing state-level policy here in Rhode Island and across most of New England. There are carbon pricing bills being debated. I'm curious, first of all, whether you think that domestically, state-level action is going to increase or have any effect on partisanship and the prospect of ultimately federal-level climate policy, and then also internationally, whether you think state-level action in any way colors the perceptions of other UNFCCC parties regarding how the U.S. views climate policy and whether we're committed to action.
Yeah, so very good questions. So on the domestic side, I think in most cases domestic action will not kind of run headlong into what the Trump administration's doing. There could be exceptions to that. Okay, so I'll give you an example. If the Trump administration winds all the way backwards on the vehicle standards, California back at some point earlier on, I think in the Obama years, got a waiver from EPA so that it could have still higher standards than the feds. All right, let's suppose, and Jerry Brown is gonna put his fist right in the face of the administration if he has to. I mean, Jerry Brown does not back down to anybody, and he's completely committed. California, by the way, is the 6th largest economy in the world, looked at as its own economy, and has a climate program that is second to none, literally the best. He's not going to back down on that. If the Trump administration were to decide not just to go backwards generally, but to try to have EPA revoke that waiver, they'll be in court the next day and there'll be a big fight. So you could imagine that kind of thing. But generally, Texas, this one, that one, states are doing renewable portfolio standards or other kinds of positive policy actions. I don't think that you'll see the feds coming after them, but there could be exceptions. On your international question, I think that's actually just a great question, and it's something that I've actually been giving a lot of thought to myself lately. I think it is. And in the immediate aftermath of the election, I talked to some friends who are high up in both California and New York, and I would love to see a coalition of progressive states, both for what they could do in terms of ramping up their own actions domestically and how they might collaborate together. But I also think it would be a very useful thing in terms of international politics if we were able to convey in the setting, let's say, of the UNFCCC, that whatever was or wasn't going on in Washington, there are still strong pockets and big pockets of influence and power and action in the United States. Maybe those pockets add up to whatever it is, 30, 40, 25, 46, I don't know what, but percent of people, of GDP, of emissions, whatever the metric is, and that there's commitment and action, and that this is not a period of quiescence and passivity, which frankly is, I think, the way it looked in those years from 2001 to 2008. I think it would be a very useful thing for the sake of kind of the U.S. image broadly and on this issue, if progressive states, and by the way, progressive cities also, were to do that, and if what they were doing then was conveyed in the right way, in the right platform internationally.
Great. Yes, please. And then we'll come over here.
So hi, my name is Kara. I'm a junior at Brown. So I was interested in the way that you approach the climate negotiations from a financial standpoint.
Yeah.
So there are really easy ways, to quantify the costs of renewable energy and climate change policy. So in investment, in infrastructure, in subsidies, but it can be a whole lot harder to try to put an actual monetary value on like the benefits that you get from it, because a lot of the problems of climate change in the long term are things like healthcare costs and relocation and natural disaster payments, and of course those are all dependent on how long it takes you to implement policies. So how do you consider cost versus benefit when you go into negotiations?
Yeah, well, these are all great questions. So the difficulty of the match between cost and benefit is one of the reasons that it has always traditionally been hard to make the case for climate action, particularly in places like the US where there's resistance. And you have kind of two mismatches. Again, because remember that cost of carbon is externalized. It has not been internalized through a price, so that you see the cost right up front, right in front of you in ways that you can add up. And the benefits are harder to quantify, are more long-term, and are all the things that you just said. So I think that is I think a problem that more has to do with public opinion in a sense than anything else. The way finance comes up in the negotiations is typically not through that lens. The way finance has come up in the negotiations, and it's a difficult issue, and it continues to be a difficult issue, is that there is an understandable, although in some ways not, well, in many ways not entirely helpful, but on the other hand, you can understand it, demand by poorer countries for large-scale financial assistance from wealthier countries. And the most famous one of the commitments that were made that have been made in negotiations goes back to 2009 as part of the Copenhagen Accord, that 2.5-page agreement that was cobbled together in the last 20 hours of the negotiations by leaders and their aides. But that's a commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year of financial assistance for developing countries. Mobilize is a carefully chosen word, which is chosen to include both money from government coffers that is provided either bilaterally or through the World Bank or in other ways, but also private capital that is incentivized by various kinds of government actions. If the U.S. Development Bank is called OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, if OPIC is providing guarantees for XYZ loans, that provides incentive for private banks to provide that sort of assistance. So the thing that is, and I will cut this answer off because otherwise I could go on too long, but the thing that is inarguably right is that there is a pressing, urgent need for large-scale capital to go to developing countries to develop their clean energy infrastructure and to deal with, to build their own resilience. And a lot of that funding needs to be private capital because there's just not enough available public capital to do it. And there's ways that can be, really the issue is always that funding to those countries tends to be risky, but the big focus on financing has to be how to unlock that money. To the extent that the conversation within the UNFCCC is less productive than it could be, that tends to be because there is a kind of either stated or understated blame narrative from many developing countries wanting to say, don't talk to us about private, don't talk to us about mobilizing, this is your fault, you owe us, it's a reparation and that kind of thing. And that just doesn't get anywhere. But it's a huge, huge big issue.
I thought that was a great question and a great answer. But I think there's a slightly different way, though, to think about some of the costs and benefits, which isn't inconsistent with anything you've just said. But had you asked me, ex ante, whether switching to one of these devices, no brand, one of these devices, I don't know, 15 years ago, whenever it was that when we were first buying all these, there are all these costs and not really a whole lot of upside. And then enough people buy these things and Facebook, all
Right.
these different industries and markets and value is mobilized, and we end up living our lives differently. And I don't mean to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but one could imagine something similar with, say, electrification of transport, where the car, whatever brand it is, becomes as much a device, a sensor, as a vehicle, and it's also a mobile transport and linked to smart grid and leading to a different way of living lives. And so, again, not to be too rose-tinted about this, but there is a potential huge technological upside or economic upside.
Totally agree. Totally
I just
agree.
wish that could be sold, so to speak, to a public, or at least enough people persuaded that it's not just about cost for climate any more than it's just about cost for new technology and IT or communications or big data. And in fact, the two are quite related.
We have to
maybe in
get
some
the
ways.
right messengers, because if I have the highest respect for him, but if all of this came from leaders like Al Gore, you're only going to penetrate so far into the parts of the country that need to be persuaded.
Yeah, great, thanks. Please.
My name's Clayton. I'm a junior at Brown. I was wondering, so should the Trump administration decide to exit the Paris Agreement, do you think it's likely that there'd be a backlash from other countries and that they would leave the agreement too? Or do other countries tend to be more loyal to the agreement regardless of whether the United States is involved?
So first of all, just so everybody is clear on the kind of formalities of this, the U.S. actually cannot formally withdraw from the agreement for 4 years. The way the agreement was set up, once it enters into force, and the Obama administration led the way to get this agreement entered into force in astonishingly quick time, record time. So you needed 55% of countries representing 55% of global emissions. Nobody in their right mind would have believed that could have been done in 1 year. But it was. The very last thing that I negotiated with the Chinese, with my great friend Xi Jinping, was an agreement that the US and China together would both join in 2016, and that paved the way. That was at the end of March of that year, and that paved the way to getting this done, but with a lot more work having happened. But having said that, in a minute, the United States could say the agreement's dead to us. We're walking away. We will formally withdraw when we can, but as of right now, we're paying no attention to it. That they can do, and that's obviously what, from my point of view, we very much want them not to do. If they did that, I think my own view is that again, it would be very, very damaging to the United States around the world. I do not think other countries would pull out. I think other countries are invested in the need to deal with climate change. They're invested in Paris as an historic and well-balanced agreement. If you didn't have Paris, you'd kind of have to create it again. And trust me, it is very, very hard to negotiate an agreement like this with so many moving pieces and needing to get consensus. You have to get everybody's got to be on board to get this done. So I think countries would not immediately pull out, and they wouldn't want to give the U.S. the satisfaction of being able to wreck it like that. And they would be, I think, playing the bet that the U.S. will be back. Having said that, with the U.S. not in, with the U.S. not really playing a part, there's plenty of damage that can be done to the Paris Agreement over the course of the next 4 years. There are a number of steps to further implement the agreement that are teed up. There's guidelines, more detailed guidelines that have to be negotiated on transparency and finance and other issues. There's the first kind of global stock take in 2018, the first review of country targets in 2020. All of these things and the procedures that get developed to put them in place are going to be negotiated. And if the U.S. walks away, I think that can open the door for various countries. Most countries were very supportive of this, but not everybody liked it. And it will certainly provide an opening for countries who want to make mischief with the U.S. not there to sort of torque this in a not good direction. And again, I think one of the really important things over the next 4 years is to try to prevent that.
Thanks. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a sophomore. I was hoping you could provide some insight into how you foresee the international community will address the climate refugee challenge.
Could you say it one more time?
Sorry, I'm sick, so we'll talk closer to the microphone.
That's better. That's better.
Okay. I was hoping you could provide insight into how the international community will address the problem of climate refugees in the coming years.
That is a very hard question. There's an issue that went under or that goes still under the rubric of loss and damage, which was on the docket. It was part of the discussion leading up to Paris and in Paris, and it was and language was included in Paris about it. The U.S. is quite supportive, was quite supportive, I don't know about now, the U.S. was quite supportive of setting up certain procedures for dealing with it, but really the hardest part of that is that many, the biggest proponents of this issue were small islands that in some cases face genuinely existential threats. The problem was on the one hand, an understandable desire to have a compensation fund. On the other hand, a politically ruinous idea of an uncontrolled, unlimited, potentially gargantuan compensation fund, and trying to sell that to whatever your local political environment is, whether it's in the U.S. or the U.K. or Europe or wherever. So I think that what I said when we discussed this any number of times internally when I was there, that I think this is a large-scale problem. There's somebody famous once, I forget who, but somebody famous once said, if you have a problem that is really, really hard, make it bigger. And I think that the notion of climate refugees and potentially small nations that may have to move their whole populations is something that can't just be dealt with in the UNFCCC. I think the larger UN family needs to take this on. The UNFCCC should be part of that. But there's also refugee agencies, and I think that at the level of countries around the world, whether it's setting up some kind of capitalized fund, or I'm really not sure, but there needs to be attention given to this, but simply through a provision of the UNFCCC, having an open-ended, unlimited compensation fund is not going to work.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It's been amazing to hear you speak. So I was wondering, given the current political arena, how you would recommend that young people interested in climate policy get involved in international policy over the next few years?
Yeah. Thank you very much. So here's the one thing I would say for sure, which is don't give up and don't be resigned. Right? I mean, you can never totally control the cards that you're ever playing. If you're committed to working on an issue like this and you have the good fortune to be at a moment when you can play offense, when you can be working on the good positive things that you can do, as happened in the Obama years, both domestically and internationally, that's terrific. But if you find yourself in a moment when you've got to play defense to prevent the worst things from happening, that's just as important. And so I think that that certainly people in this room and in other rooms all over the country, and very, very particularly young people, this is about your future. This is about all of our futures, but it's going to be more and more about young people's futures. So I think that there are all sorts of places. You said international. The international, this can include international. A lot of this is also domestic, but there are. So I'll speak to both. There are states, there are cities, there are NGOs, there are businesses that are progressive businesses or businesses that have a progressive outlook on this issue. There's international institutions, places like the World Bank and others that engage on this issue. There are places to act. And particularly if there are places to act, if you're really looking to devote your professional attention to this, and even if you're not, what we need to develop in this country is a populace that conveys a message to elected officials that inaction is not acceptable and is going to have a cost on election day. And so, even though this is a moment where you could look and say, oh my God, it's all going backwards, like there's nothing I can do, I mean, you can't do that. I counsel you not to do that. And I'll tell you, without going into details for myself, before November 8th, I was looking at sort of dividing my time between doing some writing about the experience I just had and doing some private sector work. After November 8th, I've recalibrated that. The private sector stuff is going to probably have to wait. I'm going to do writing, but I'm also am looking at ways and talking with a number of my colleagues from the White House and the State Department, former colleagues, about ways in which, both on the domestic and international level, we can try to defend the Paris regime and keep it from rolling off the rails. So I think there's a lot of different places for young people to get engaged, and just don't give up.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Adele, and I'm a fourth year studying geology. I have kind of a two-pronged question. First, what is the changing role for scientists as partners in climate policy? And secondly, what skills can scientists be working on to be more effective partners?
So science, it kind of all starts with science at some level. I mean, what drives action on climate change? What drives action on climate change, above all, is the unfortunately worsening signals that we get from the natural world, and whether that's sea level rise or the stress globally, additional stress on water, it's droughts, it's floods, it's storms, it's all sorts of things, and it's both the actual events that we see, but also the scientific analysis of those things. I mean, I just give you one small example of an important article that was, I forget now, it was within the last 6 months that was written about in one of the science magazines, which basically was keyed to a different way scientifically to measure melting ice in Greenland, and with undoubtedly application to the Antarctica as well. And the different assessment of how to measure that melting ice, and a different, not just of how to measure, but a different assessment of the internal dynamics of the ice melting and what was causing the ice melting to melt, had an impact, according to this article. Now, there may be others who have different views, but it was very, very widely positively regarded in the scientific community. Literally double the potential high side estimate for this century, from 3 to 6 feet of how high sea level could rise. Well, so that's huge. So the work of science in continuing to understand all of the dynamics of climate change is just hugely important. That when the skeptics or deniers say, the science is unproven, well, that's not true. The basic elements of the science are overwhelmingly clear, but there's huge amounts that are unknown. How ice melts, what's the effect of even something like the effect of clouds is not well understood yet. So and these things can have a tremendous impact on the time scale at which very problematic impacts could happen. So that's one thing. I think science is absolutely, that's the foundation of all of this. The place where science could improve is in some level the capacity to speak in a straightforward, understandable way so that the public can get it. And so even intermediaries can grab the science, intermediaries who may be better messengers, who can then grab the core elements and communicate them and try to mobilize people to act. But science is key.
Great, thanks. Because time is running short, I'm going to ask you both to ask your questions, and then Todd will have a chance to answer. Go ahead.
Great. Hey there, I'm Asher. My question is, you talked a few times about needing the right messengers to adopt successful policy, and I'm just wondering who you see as those messengers potentially being. Thanks.
And one more question.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you so much for all the work that you've done. My name is Ugo. I'm a sophomore here at Brown, and I'm a member of an indigenous community down in the Ecuadorian Amazonia. And as indigenous people, we've been trying to be very creative, create our own foundation, as you were mentioning earlier. It's risky to invest, and for that reason, we were able to work with different foundations and trained our own people to manage our land, 1,000 people managing over 1 million acres of land. And so we learned that it costs about 25 cents to manage 1 hectare of land. But unfortunately, working with different foundations, we've run out of resources. And as the people who are in the front lines, as my people, I just kind of wanted to hear from you to see if you had any suggestions.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. All of these questions have been great. It's been a great group, so thank you. So messengers, when I say that, when I talk about messengers, I think that the basic analysis would be to look at the cross-section of people who tend to be more disbelieving of or negative about the need to take action on climate change, who just sort of don't get it for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't seem to touch their lives that much. Who might lean toward a more conservative tilt bent politically in general, but I think if you just at a kind of broad level, if you're trying to talk, for example, to the farming community, people who are from that community could be good messengers. If you're trying to talk to people who might be more about jobs in the economy, if you've got an articulate and compelling CEO, that could be useful. Look, a guy who I've actually, in a funny way, gotten to know in the last couple of years, Governor Schwarzenegger from California. So, like, big, strong guy, movie hero, right? He's a champion on these issues. He was a champion in California. He still is. That's a guy who, if you imagine putting him in front of an audience of a bunch of red state, red meat kind of guys and women who want to know, like, why should we worry about this? I'm just talking about people who are going to look instinctively at certain messengers and say, okay, they speak my language. If this guy's telling me I need to worry about this, see, maybe I do. And I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify, but I think that there is some reality to that. On the question about Ecuador and work on lands, and look, first of all, I salute you for doing that. That's I've tended to talk in my various comments today to focus much more on energy, and energy is probably 2/3 or 70% or whatever of the problem. But the use of lands and the use of forests and the cutting down of forests is probably a good 30%, maybe even a little bit more of the problem. So that is nothing to sneeze at, and the capacity to have people compensated for preserving rather than destroying lands, like including forests, is hugely important. I think that there's foundation money that goes for this. Is there enough? I'm sure there's not enough. But there is, if anything, right now there is more mobilization in the foundation community, certainly in the United States, than there was before, because you have foundations that are and high net worth individuals who are very supportive of and activists on this issue, that look at Washington and want to make sure that they can at least partly step into the breach. I can't tell you exactly which place to go to, but the work is enormously important. And I made it to Ecuador once during my time, and it's that whole region, from Brazil and Ecuador and Peru and forested lands in South America is hugely important. So I salute your work.
And Todd, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your service to public policy in this country, your service to addressing an issue that, of course, affects everybody globally. And I hope you'll join me in especially thanking Todd for sharing so much wisdom with us today and visiting Brown.
Thank you. Thank you to you.